And welcome back to Heavier Than Heaven by Charles L. Cross. Read to you by Bradley Dahlberg in 2024. Finally up to Chapter 3. Meatballs of the Month. Montesano, Washington, July 1979 through March 1982. His favorite food and drink are pizza and Coke. His favorite saying is "excuse you," from the Puppy Press profile. In 1979, Kurt began 7th grade at Montesano Junior High School. It was an important milestone. The school began to take on a bigger role in his life. He began music class in 5th grade, and by 7th grade he was playing drums with the school band, an accomplishment he sought to downplay in his friends while he was savoring it. Most of what he studied and practiced was marching band or small ensemble drums, learning snare and bass drum for songs like Louie Louie and Tequila. The Monty band rarely marched, mostly as they played for the assemblies of the basketball games, but Kurt was a fixture at any event where they appeared. And it's crazy because I did the same exact thing. I played in the school pep band also. I played the drums at every single sporting event for 4 years for sure. His band director Tim Nielsen remembered him as a regular run-of-the-mill music student. He was not extraordinary, but he wasn't also awful. Kurt was pictured that year in the Montesano Sylvan book playing the snare drum at an assembly. He had a page boy haircut and looked a bit like a young Brad Pitt. His clothing tended to look kind of preppy, and the typical outfit included hash bell-bottom jeans, a stupid Zayed rugby shirt, and Nike athletic sneakers. He dressed like every other 12-year-old, though he was slightly short and small for his age. As one of the more popular kids in school, he was selected to be profiled in the October 26, 1979 edition of the Mimeograph Student. The Mimeograph Student newspaper, the Puppy Press. The article ran under the heading "Meatball of the Month" and read, "Kurt is a 7th grader at our school. He has blonde hair and blue eyes. He thinks school is all right. Kurt's favorite class is band, and his favorite school teacher is Mr. Prep, or Mr. Hep. His favorite food and drink are pizza and Coke. His favorite saying is "excuse you." His favorite song at the moment is "Don't Bring Me Down" by ELO, and his favorite rock group is Meatloaf. His favorite TV show is Taxi, and his favorite actor is Burt Reynolds." The "excuse you" saying was Kurt's twist on Steve Martin's "excuse me." This wasn't the constant. This was consistent with his wry and sarcastic sense of humor, which involved transposing phrases or asking absurd rhetorical questions. Imagine an adolescent Andy Rooney. Typical of these jokes was he shouted out at a bonfire, "How can you ruin a perfectly good fire?" By making smoke. Being a small boy, his method of surviving within the adolescent male culture was to joke his way through it out of his conflicts, and belittle any tormentors with the superior intellect. Kurt watched countless hours of television, and this was a running battle with Don and Jenny. They wished to limit his hours in front of the tube, but he begged and screamed for more. When he was denied his freedom, he simply would visit his best friend Rod Marsh, who lived a block away, and watch television there. Though Saturday Night Live was past his bedtime, he rarely missed a week. And the next Monday at school, he'd be imitating all the best skips, and he also did a wicked impression of Latka, Andy Kaufman's character on Taxi. The previous summer, Kurt had dropped out of Little League, but when the winter came, he joined the junior varsity wrestling squad, which pleased his father, and Don attended every match and endlessly quizzed Kurt on his progress. The coach, Kenichi Kanan, the Monty art teacher, Kurt joined the team and would spend more time with Kanano as to wrestle. In Kanano, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Kurt found a male role model who encouraged his creativity, and he became Kano's favorite student. One of Kurt's drawings was featured on the cover of the Puppy Press that Halloween. It showed a bulldog, Montesano's mascot, emptying a trick-or-treat bag on a doghouse. In a typical Cobain touch, he hid the can of beer among the candy. In a typical Cobain touch, he hid a can of beer among the candy. For the Christmas card that year, Kurt drew a pen and ink portrait of a small boy who was attempting to fish, but had to cast the hook into his back. It was as good as most Hallmark cards, a classmate Nikki Clark remembered. Kurt's artwork was always very good. Kanano never had to help him since he seemed like an advanced student. Even when he wasn't in art class, Clark recalled, Kurt was never far from a pen. He doodled constantly in every class. His doodles mostly were of cars, trucks, guitars. He also began to craft his own crude pornography. He once showed me the sketch that he drew. I did the same shit in school. This is crazy. But it's crazy. I did it way before I ever read this book. I drew so much crude pornography in school. It's crazy. It was totally a realistic picture of a vagina. I asked him, "What's that?" And he laughed. At the time, Kurt had never seen a vagina up close, except in the books or adult magazines the boys traded. Another specialty was Satan, a figure he sketched in his notebook during every class. Rosny Toira was Kurt's girlfriend in 7th grade, but it was an innocent first crush that never got serious. He began to piece his art to tie into their union. There were kids in school that were clearly troubled or were outcasts, but he wasn't one of them. She said about the only thing that was different was that he was quieter than most kids, and he wasn't unsociable, just quiet. At home, he was anything but quiet, complaining ferociously over what he felt were unfair treatments from Don and Jenny. A few second marriages with children ever meld perfectly, but this was always the delicate ground, and issues of favoritism and fairness would haunt the family. Kurt's complaints usually led to arguments between Don and Jenny or increased his parents' rancor, which continued to simmer over the issues of visitation and child support. Don complained that Wendy made Kim phone if his support check was late by a day. Toward the end of 7th grade, the school nurse could call, and Kurt's proportions were that they considered borderline scoliosis of curvature of the spine. Don and Jenny took Kurt to the doctor, and after their thorough examination, the physician determined that Kurt didn't suffer from the syndrome, and he simply had longer arms than most kids for his size, which made the original measurements seem askew. But this didn't assure Wendy. Through the family system of communication, which resembled a bad version of the children's game of telephone. She had heard that Kurt had scoliosis, and she was shocked that Don wasn't alarmed and that Kurt wasn't in a full body cast. Kurt decided to believe his mother's diagnosis, and then years later he claimed that he had minor scoliosis in junior high. Though his assertion is at odds with the facts, Kurt used it more of one example of how his father had failed him. Like many children of divorce, Kurt masterfully played each parent off each other. In 1980, Wendy was working in Monty at a county commissioner's office, and Kurt frequently visited her after school, if only to report on somehow new torture was put upon him by Don and Jenny. As things became worse for Kurt and Monty, he hoped that Wendy would take him back. But his mother had her own problems at the time with Frank Franek, and she told Kim she feared that if Kurt witnessed the dysfunction in their home that he would turn gay. Years later, when Kurt brought out the topic, Wendy and Kim and his mom told him, "Kurt, you don't ever know what it's like. You have ended up in juvie or jail." One of Kurt's repeat laments to Wendy and Jenny's children were favored in the household when Jenny's ex-husband would give Minnie and James gifts. Kurt felt jealous and assumed the discipline meted out to him was because he wasn't Jenny's biological child. He had told his friends that he hated Jenny and complained about her cooking and claimed that she rationed how much soda he was allowed to drink. He was asserted Jenny could hear a Pepsi can open from 3 rooms away, and for lunch he was allowed only 2 slices of Carl Budding ham per sandwich and 2 at Grandma's cookies. Leland Cobain would lecture Don about what he thought was a prejudice against Kurt. There could be a fruit sitting on the table, and Mindy and James could go up and take an apple and start eating it. Kurt would go get one like that, and Don and Jenny would give him hell for it. Leland speculated that Don was so afraid Jenny would leave him, like Wendy had. He sided with Jenny and her children. Don admitted discipline was more a problem with Kurt than it was with Jenny's kids, but argued it was because Kurt's personality and not favoritism. But Don did worry that Jenny would leave him if Kurt became too much of a trouble. I was afraid that it was going to get to the point where it's either he goes or she goes, and I didn't want to lose her. Kurt's relationship with his siblings and step-siblings became more of a balanced as he grew older. He adored his half-brother Chad because he loved babies, and he'd punch Mindy. But the occasion was there was no school. He'd spend the day playing with her, and yet Kurt's schoolmates would mention his family, and several buddies thought Mindy was cute, and he was quick to correct them if they called her his sister. He described Mindy to his friends as not my sister, it's my dad's new wife's daughter, speaking the words as if there was some kind of torture he was forced to endure. He and James got along better, perhaps because Kurt was never overshadowed by the younger boy. When another boy slugged James, who was the bat boy, not on Kurt's baseball team, Kurt stepped in and threatened the attacker. They also shared an interest in movies. In the summer, the family would go to a 2-screen drive-in. Don and Jenny would each take a car, and then park the kids in front of the PG-rated movie, and they would watch the adult film on the other screen. Kurt taught James that rather than having to sit and do another one of Don's Knott's comedies, they could walk over to the bathroom and view the adult fare, like heavy metal, which Kurt loved, by standing just out by the side of the lot. Kurt enjoyed describing films he had already seen to his younger stepbrother. He had watched The Close Encounters of the Third Kind. In the previous year, he would recall the dialogue from the film. He used to play with his mashed potatoes at dinner and make them into the shape of a mountain from that movie, James recalled. In 1981, a 14-year-old Kurt began to make his own short films using his parents' Super 8 camera. One of his first productions would elaborate Orson Welles' War of the Worlds ripoff that showed aliens played by Kurt sculpted with clay landing in Cobain's backyard, and he showed the alien film to James in a successful attempt to convince his younger brother that their house had been invaded. Another film he made in 1982 shows a far darker side of his new psyche. He titled Kurt Commits Bloody Suicide. In it, Kurt, playing in the camera, being held by James, pretends to cut his wrists with the edge of a torn half pop can. The film is complete with special effects and fake blood, Kurt dramatically playing out his own final death scene in a manner that he must muse and have seen in silent pictures. This gruesome film simply added ammunition to the concerns his parents had already felt about the darkness they saw inside him. There was something wrong, Jenny argued. Something wrong with this thought process. Even from the beginning, something is unbalanced. He was able to calmly discuss the kinds of events that he would give most young boys nightmares. Murder, rape, suicide. He wasn't the only teenage boy in history to bring up self-slaughter, but the offhanded was the way he joked about it, struck by his friends as odd. One day, he and John Fields were walking home and became from school when the Fields told Kurt that he should be an artist. But Kurt casually announced that he had other plans. I'm going to be a superstar musician, kill myself, and go out in the fame and glory. He said that that's the stupidest thing I ever heard, his friend said. Don't talk that way. But Kurt was steadfast. No, I want to be rich and famous and kill myself like Jimi Hendrix. Neither boy was aware that Hendrix's death wasn't suicide. Fields was not the only friend of Kurt's from Monty who reported such a story. A half-dozen other acquaintances tell similar versions of the same conversation, always with the same dark outcome. Kurt would be... It's so funny how he's like trying to plant the suicide fucking shit in the very beginning of his youth. There's just no way that shit happened. I don't even buy it for a second. This is something that Courtney sold. It's not true. There's just no way. That Kim was talking indifferently about suicide at the age of 14 didn't surprise anyone in the family. 2 years earlier, Kurt's greatest uncle, 66-year-old Kurt Cobain, Leland's oldest brother, had used a stun-dose .38 pistol to shoot himself in both the stomach and head. Leland had discovered the body, and there were allegations that Burl was about to be charged with sexual molestation. Burl hadn't been to disclose it to the family as Kurt's uncles, but Kurt talked about it incessantly with his friends. He would casually joke that his uncle had killed himself over the death of Jim Morrison, though Morrison had passed away a decade before. What had been a joke to Kurt was a devastating blow to Leland. The year prior to Burl's suicide in 1978, Leland's brother Ernest had died of cerebral hemorrhage. While Ernest's death at 57 was not officially ruled a suicide, it came in after that he had been warned that he would die, that if he continued drinking, he persisted and eventually fell down the stairs, causing an aneurysm that killed him. These were the only deaths that affected Kurt. When Kurt was in 8th grade at Montesano, a boy hanged himself outside one of the elementary schools. Kurt knew the boy, and it was Bill Burgart's brother. Kurt, Burgart, and Rod Marsh discovered the corpse hanging from a tree as they were walking to school, and they stared at it for a half an hour before the school officials finally shooed them away. It was the most grotesque thing I ever saw in my life, recalled Marsh. From Kurt's own family history, and from the incidents of suicide, became a concept, and a word that no longer was unmentionable. It was instead simply part of the milieu, just like alcoholism, poverty, or drugs. Kurt told Marsh that he had suicide genes. Bull fucking shit he did. Bull fucking shit. Courtney, you can just suck a dick for fucking telling Charles Cross this shit. Kurt's experimentations with drugs commenced in 8th grade when he started smoking marijuana and using LSD. He began smoking pot at parties, and then with his friends, and finally smoking on a daily basis by himself. By 9th grade, he was a full-on pothead. Marijuana was cheap and plentiful in Monty, and most of it was homegrown, and it helped Kurt forget his home life. What began a social ritual became his own anesthetic. At the time when he began using drugs, he also started cutting class regularly. And when he skipped school, his friends, they would also buy weed and steal booze from someone's parents' liquor cabinet. But Kurt stated skipping school by himself or going to school just to be leaving for the first period. He saw less of his friends and appeared alienated from everything else except his own anger. Trevor Briggs ran into Kurt New Year's Eve in 1980, sitting in a park in Monty by himself, swinging on a swing and whistling. Trevor invited Kurt to his parents, and the two got high while watching Dick Clark on television. The year ended with the both of them throwing up from smoking an excessive amount of homegrown. And what a couple of years earlier had seemed like an idyllic place to go to school soon became Kurt's own prison. In conversations with his friend, he now slammed Monty along with his parents, and having to read Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, he declared the book a perfect description of the town. By the beginning of 1981, indifferent. Kurt had begun to emerge, and not just emerge, and was more of a case. He spent the amounts of time in isolation in the Fleet Street's house. He had moved to remodel basements as a bedroom. Kurt told his friends that he felt a shift in banishment. In the basement room, Kurt spent his time in the Montgomery Ward's pinball machine. He had gotten for Christmas a stereo Don and Jenny had handed down to him, and a stack of albums. The record collection included Elton John, Grand Funk Railroad, Boston. Kurt's favorite album that year was Journey's Evolution. He conflicts with Don and Jenny and had reached a breaking point. The conflicts with Don and Jenny reached a breaking point. All their attempts to get him involved with the family failed. He began to boycott the family night, and feeling internally abandoned himself, decided to outwardly abandon his family. We had chores for him, just typical stuff, but he wouldn't do them, Don remembered. We begun to try to bribe him with an allowance, but if he didn't do the certain chores, we'd subtract from the allowance. But he refused to do anything. It ended up him owing us money. He'd get violent and slam doors and storm downstairs, and he'd also seem to have fewer friends. I noticed that some of his friends were dropping off, said Jenny. He was home a lot more, and he wasn't with us. When he was home, he seemed to become a lot more introverted, and he was quiet and sullen. Rod Marsh recalled that Kurt killed a neighbor's cat that year. In this incident of teenage sadism, that would be the thinking, striking contrast to his adult life. He trapped the still-alive animal in his parents' chimney and laughed when it died and stunk up the house. In September 1981, Kurt began his freshman year, high school in Montesano. That failed in an attempt to fit in. He turned out for the football team. He made his first cut, despite his small stature, an indication that more than anything else of how the school in Montesano was. He practiced for 2 weeks, then dropped out, complaining that it was too much work. That year, he also joined the track team. He threw in the discus, an amazing feat considering his frame, and ran the 200-yard dash, and he was by no means the best athlete on the squad. He missed many practices, but he was one of the faster boys, and he was pictured in the school yearbook photo of the squad squinting into the sun. In February of that year, in a moment of serendipity, Uncle Chuck told Kurt he had to have either a bicycle or electric guitar for his 14th birthday. To a boy who drew pictures of rock stars in a notebook, it was no choice at all. Kurt had already destroyed a Hawaiian lap guitar of Don's. He had taken it apart to study the internal workings. The guitar Chuck bought him wasn't much better. It was cheap, second-hand Japanese model. It often broke, but Kurt, it was the air that he breathed. Not knowing how to put the strings on it, he called up his Aunt Marie and asked her if it was strung alphabetically. Once he got it working, he played it constantly and carried it to school to show it off to everyone. Everyone asked him about it, remembered Trevor Briggs. I saw him with it on the street. He told me, "Don't ask me how to play any songs on this, it's broken." That didn't matter. It wasn't much of an instrument, it was an identity. Athletics were a part of his identity. He had continued with wrestling, moving up as a freshman to the varsity squad. The Montesano Bulldogs won the league championship that year with a record of 12 wins and 3 losses. Though Kurt wasn't a significant part of the effort, he began to skip more practices and matches, and on the varsity teams, his size was a huge disadvantage. The attitude on the JV team 2 years earlier was that wrestling was fun and way to roughhouse. The varsity team in contract was deadly serious. The practices required him to wrestle boys who instantly pinned him. At the end of the season, Kurt sat for the team's pitcher, wearing a knee-high striped socks, among the behemoths of the team who looked more like a trainer than a member of the squad. It was on varsity wrestling mat, but Kurt staged one of his greatest battles with his father. On the day of the championship match, as Kurt told it, he went out into the ring, intending to send a message to Don in the bleachers. As Kurt later described Michael Lazaret, I waited for the whistle to blow, just staring into Don's face, and then I instantly clammed up. I put my arms up together and let the guy pin me. Kurt claimed that he did this 4 times in a row and was pinned instantly. Every time, and Don walked out in disgust. Don Cobain asserted the story was false. Kurt's classmates don't recall it and argue that anyone who intentionally lost would have been shunned, if not pummeled, by the other teammates. But Leland Cobain remembered Don telling him the story after the match, saying that little shit just laid there. He wouldn't fight back. Kurt was the master of exaggerating a yarn so as to tell an emotional truth rather than to tell an actual one. But most likely happened was that Kurt had a match against a better opponent and decided not to fight back, which was enough to anger his perfectionist father. But Kurt telling of the tale of his description looked like a flash between him and his father and as evidence of just how much their relationship had deteriorated in the 6 years since the divorce. They had once spent every spare hour together, and on the day that Don bought the mini bike, Kurt never loved anyone more. Just down the street from the Montesano High was a restaurant that they used to sit at, just the two of them, alone in a singular entity, a family, and eat a quiet dinner together, joined in their loneliness a little boy who wanted nothing more than to spend the rest of his life with his dad, and a father who only wanted someone to love him with the love that would not fade. But the 6 years after, the father and the son were locked in a wrestling match of wills, and like a great tragedies, neither constant felt he could afford to lose. Kurt desperately needed a father, and Don needed to be wanted by his son, but neither could admit this. It was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. No matter how far Kurt moved away from the wrestling mat, in the corner of his eye he always looking directly at his father, or more accurate, since his relationship with his father was virtually dead to him after the point of looking at his father's ghost. Almost a decade after his freshman wrestling defeat, Kurt would fire off a bitter lyric in a song, Serve the Servants, the words yet another of his never-ending bouts with his greatest opponent. I never tried hard to have a father, but instead I had a dad. And that there's the end of chapter 3. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.